No doubt we live in a divided America. Everybody sees it, everybody knows it, everybody has to pick a side. Everybody has to fight for their side, and everybody thinks their side will win. There's not much middle ground, and there are few referees. And it seems like it's a knockdown, drag out every day. And rather than our political leaders for both sides duking it out in Washington, these days it's an all play whereby everybody pipes up, creating a cacophony of voices and communication overload, and screaming is de rigueur, even on social media with the all caps and expletives. America's angry, and she's not interested much in anger management. After the presidential election of 2020, the left accused the right of insurrection, and the right accused the left of fraud. The left wants their feelings to be understood, and the right wants their reason and logic to be understood. And meanwhile, both sides say that a nation divided against itself cannot stand. The question is, how long are we going to remain divided before we implode? I'm Terry Gilberg. This is Timeline with Terry, and today's Timeline topic, anger in America. But is it righteous anger?
CTA is a call to action to all conservatives to save America from left-wing radicals.
Nearly 45% of the U.S. workforce already have plans for job hopping in 2021. Now, many of those 70 million job hoppers are just fed up, and they're ready to work somewhere else, somewhere where they will be free. Maybe it's time for your talents to go to a city or a company that actually values your freedom. Post your resume on redballoon.org so that you can connect with this ever-growing list of free speech employers who would love to hire you.
All right, guys, you have signed up, right? You've joined freedomsquare.com. If you haven't, why not? This should have happened a decade ago. How did somebody not think of this earlier? If you're a business owner, we have a business directory to promote your business to patriots across the nation. So if you want to buy American, if you want to sell American, we have a business directory. Whatever it is, go now.
Join us in the fight for freedom. Welcome to Freedom Square.
Welcome back to Timeline with Terry, the show where we invite experts to visit with me a while, share their expertise, their research, their data, their experiences, and their knowledge so that we can better understand the complex topics of our day, such as why are we so angry at each other? Is it warranted, as in righteous anger, or do we just want to pick a fight? Either way, it can't last unless, of course, we want to kill the country. If we put up a fight, can we keep up the fight? No, we can't. Certainly not forever. And in the meantime, it's taking quite a toll. There's a new book out, and it's called Wrath, America Engaged. The author is Peter Wood. He's the president of the National Association of Scholars and a former professor of anthropology. He's also a college provost. In 2019, he received the Jeane Kirkpatrick Prize for contributions to academic freedom, and he's with us now. Peter Wood, welcome to Timeline with Terry. Hello.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
It's so nice to have you. Let's get right to it. First of all, I want to thank you for writing such a book. This is a kind of book that I think needs to be told because it gives a look at the vibe of America. I guess that's a good way of putting it. And it kind of says, to me anyway, there's two sides. There is this vitriol on both sides. Everybody sees that there's two sides. Everybody sees we're a divided nation. We have to now fight for our side because we don't just get to sit on the sidelines. And it seems everybody is in the fight. So before we get into some of the vibe that we're seeing, how did, Peter, we get like this? Give us a little backstory, a little history. What caused such a divided nation that we see today?
Well, I started in an unusual place with this. I think we got to our angrified nation culturally before we got there politically. It's very clear these days that the fight has moved into the political realm. But for most of the history of this country, we were a nation that took a rather censorious view of people who gave in to anger. That is, children were taught to control their tempers. Husbands and wives were taught to resolve their differences without resort to too much anger. Our cultural icons, all the way back to George Washington, were people who were known to have tempers, but who learned to control their tempers. And that found its way into our arts and our literature. Our movies frequently depicted the Gary Cooper type of people who could be provoked without giving in. All that began to change after World War II, and it changed for two reasons, two cultural importations. One of them was Freudian psychoanalysis, which gave us this idea that if you bottle up your anger and don't express it, it's going to come back at you as neurosis. So it was healthier to be angry than to try to restrain your anger. The other thing that happened was that our GIs brought back the first wave of European existentialism, the idea that anger is a way to reach your authentic self, to be real, to be true to who you are. Both those things arrived at about the same time. They arrived, first of all, among the cultural elites. It wasn't just everyday people who took these up. But by the 1960s, it had become more popularized. So we saw the protest movements of the 1960s, which were already taking in both forms of this anger, of thinking that it's healthy to be angry, let it all out. And it was also powerful to be angry. So the protest movements began to pick up the idea that the angry person was the liberated person. Now, it's a long story of how we get from the 1960s to the 2020s, but
Let me stop you there just for 1 minute. I'm intrigued. My father was in World War II, and many of the greatest generation, those who fought in World War II, and women too, but mostly men, they came back and they squashed it, Peter. They had PTSD. I know my dad did, but they sucked it up or they squashed it, and they never let anything out. And I think at the time, looking back, I remember my dad, as he got many years older, he said, you know, we could have used a little PTSD help because we all had it, we didn't acknowledge it, and we either suppressed it or squashed it. I forget which word he said. But if being your true self is to be angry, I'm not sure that all of the GIs and officers from World War II were their true self. In fact, they sucked it up or squashed it.
Mm-hmm. Well, in doing that, they did what Americans had always done before that, which is that the traumas of life were something to be endured rather than to be worn on your sleeve. I'm sure the veterans of the First World War and the Civil War likewise spent their lives with horrific experiences that they couldn't easily express. We now treat that as a terrible tragedy, and it is a tragedy for sure, but think of what the consequence was of undoing the tragedy, and that is of telling people that if you're angry, just go for it. And of course, it wasn't the veterans of World War II who got the benefits of being asked to express themselves. It was more or less their children that came along with the idea that the 50s, we think of as this buttoned up era of American life. It was the era of Allen Ginsberg, the vulgar poet. It was the era in which the Catcher in the Rye was the teenage boy who regarded all of adult life as phony, and he was going to be authentic. If you've ever read that book, you might remember the last chapter. Turns out the story is the young Holden Caulfield talking to his shrink, his psychoanalysis. So there it is, right at the beginning of the 1950s. We were discovering that the way out of your discontents in life is to engage in psychoanalysis, to engage in the attack on phoniness, which is what existentialism is all about. So it didn't happen all at once. I wouldn't say that at all, but these cracks in culture tend to expand over time. And the some of the interesting ways to watch the expansion is what happens in our movies. I think it's 1978 we got the movie about titled Network, about how television exploits anger. And that's the movie that gives us the line, "I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore."
I saw it many times.
Or their television's out the window. Well, it's expressive anger. It's now no longer an anger that anybody feels guilty at having. It's an anger in which we realize who we really are. We gain a kind of freedom by being angry. 1980s, we got the advent of talk radio, which becomes a pretty good medium for people to sound off. All of this is happening before our politics really gets that element of really vitriolic hatred wrapped up in it. That too can be made into a long story, but I'll give the short version of it. I think the crucial moment there is the Bush-Gore election. Out of that came a sort of bitterness on the left that has never gone away. The element included, one of my favorite lines from the period was the political analyst Jonathan Chait writing in Harper's Magazine, a place that would normally be pretty serious, and begins an article there, "I hate George W. Bush." There, I said it. And he's proud of himself for breaking the old taboos against this sort of expressive anger, just pouring it out on the page. Well, he and hundreds of others were at that moment when they realized that there was political hay to be made by putting on an angry act. And where the difference was between just acting angry and being angry, it began to fade away. One couldn't really tell whether somebody who was acting up was truly enraged. And I think frequently the person who was acting couldn't tell the difference. There's that way in which if you pretend to be something, chances are you will be that thing if you don't watch out.
And if you're angry, you have to have a subject to be angry about, right? If you're not angry, then everything's fine, right? So this constant angst, this constant emotional high, and this constant badgering back and forth, I think that has, well, some would say evolved from politics, or maybe devolved, because now we're like a couple ready for the divorce court, I think.
I think we are too. I would say about politics that politics is always a matter of divisions and readiness to fight. And our founders in this country knew that. That's why we have the Constitution and laws and protocols that developed in order to keep people from getting at each other's throats. It didn't always work. Somebody got caned on the floor of the Senate back in the 1860s, but we're prepared in a certain sense to think that politics could break down into animosity if we let it. For that reason, there was a dam that had to break. There was plenty of anger against earlier politicians, against Reagan, against Clinton, and so on, but there was still something holding it back until that moment when we decided that it was more fruitful to get really, really mad at each other, was to see any kind of a level ground in between. Well, since the Bush-Gore election in 2000, things have escalated quite a bit. Now, for most people looking on it today, I think what we remember is that the left really lost it when Trump won the 2016 election.
And how?
We saw in Washington mass protests and what really were riots on the day of the inauguration. Hardly covered at all by the press, but that all happened and it never went away. The left spent the Trump years in a fairly high-level tantrum that just went on and on and on, always looking for the next thing that could incite people. I politically on the other side of this, I view the 2020 election with a lot of suspicion, and I come out of it with sympathy for those who think that the mischief was sufficient to have turned the election the way it came out. That anger seems to me to hold a slightly different place in the sort of the emotional economy. The left gave itself a license to be furious for 20 years, and it still is furious in its way.
Peter, help me out with this concept. Help our audience out. When you mentioned the election of President Trump and how the left had a tantrum or erupted, and they kept that up. They kept that up all through the 4 years. But what I noticed is they kept it up mostly about his personality, not his policies. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I would strongly agree with that. His mean tweets, his ability to rouse people up at big camp-style meetings was something they couldn't bear. There was a style there that suggested he was a low-class, vulgar man, and they couldn't abide having him in charge. His policies, they didn't so much object to. He was a man who frequently moved slightly to the left for a Republican, and he adopted ideas that the Democrats had earlier championed, which put them in the position of deciding whether their hatred of him outweighed their favor for policies that he promoted.
I remember after President Trump was elected, I went and sat in the dentist chair, and I was getting my teeth cleaned, and I had no idea what hygienist I was going to get that day. But I knew that there were two hygienists in the office that were on the left. Other than that, I didn't know anybody's policies, anybody's politics of Peter. So my mouth is wide open, and she's cleaning away, and she has a captive audience because I can't speak to her, right? My mouth is open, I can't respond. And she starts in on Trump. And by the time, and I just sat there and I just listened, and I'm not even sure she knew what my politics were. Any event, once it was over, before the dentist came in to check my teeth, she pulled me up on the chair and she said, "Well, that's that, isn't it?" Expecting me to respond and expecting me to agree with her. And I said, "Well, how's your 401k, by the way?" "Oh, it's great. It's just so good and the economy's doing great." And I thought, that's about all I need to say, because the angst was always about a tweet here, or how he was mean to somebody in the Oval Office, or he would fire somebody like it was a revolving door, all of which is true. I mean, he had mean tweets, that's true. But never did I observe it was about some policy, or on the international front when he walked across the demarcation line to meet Kim Jong-un. You know, I mean, wow, who'd done that before, trying to make peace and so forth. In any event, I was struck with that, and I always remembered that. And I started to look for folks on the left talking when they talked about Trump. Rare was it when they would talk about specific policies. In fact, they even liked the wall going up, most of them.
Oh, I think so. Well, the right does anger in a different way than the left. I think partly it's a matter that the conservatives have tended to conserve some of that old reticence about emotions, that the willingness to lash out at people comes with a certain sense of guilt. That may be changing, but what happens is that while the left has been able to make a lifestyle out of being angry all the time, the right is still trying to figure out what to do with this emotion. And it's also blockaded by the steps that the Biden administration has taken. When we find that people who speak out get arrested, sometimes land in jail, where the social media of our age are all tilted towards preventing people from expressing opinions that the left doesn't approve of, you get a different kind of anger, an anger that might want to express itself, but the channels of communication have been closed to it. And the official view of the world is that the possibility that the election was tampered with, that's the big lie. So you can't talk about that. Or if you have dissenting views on the efficacy of vaccines or booster shots, that's a big lie too. You can't talk about that. We are in the midst right now, as you and I are talking, of this big protest in Canada, which may well spread to the US, of truckers saying no to all this stuff. Now, that is an embodiment of the kind of anger that I think is building. Now, I note most of all that this is a very civil kind of protest. These truckers are not out burning down cities or toppling statues or running people over. It's a protest that gains its strength by sheer numbers and magnitude. It wants to be heard. People are angry below that, Canadians of all people, who are not the most expressive in the world.
I was surprised to see that headquartered in Ottawa, Canada. I was surprised at that, and truckers coming from all over.
Right. And I do think it's likely to get here. A month or so ago, when people asked me about how I thought the anger on the right was playing out, I would bring up the elections in Virginia, the people who attend school board meetings and say enough of this critical race theory being taught to our children. I'd point to the pilots and air traffic controllers and other people who staged slowdowns or stoppages, sometimes with nurses and doctors too. So there is a resistance, a kind of civil disobedience that has begun to take form on the right. We haven't really seen anything like that before. The closest comes is the Tea Party movement of 12 years ago, which was...
I remember that. Hold your thought on that, because I want to pick up on that. And I want you to think about at the break, because I think this is a very important point. It always seems to me, Peter, that people on the right are reactive, that those on the left pushing the angst all the time, which turns into screaming, which turns into high energy anger. The right doesn't do that. The right reacts. So when the Tea Party came on the scene, that was different for the right. Hold your thoughts on that, and we'll be right back. This is Timeline with Terry. I'm Terry Gilbert with Peter Wood and his book, Wrath, America Enraged. I'll be right back.
CTA is a call to action to all conservatives to save America from left-wing radicals.
Nearly 45% of the US workforce already have plans for job hopping in 2021. Now, many of those 70 million job hoppers are just fed up, and they're ready to work somewhere else. Somewhere where they will be free. Maybe it's time for your talents to go to a city or a company that actually values your freedom. Post your resume on redballoon.work so that you can connect with this ever-growing list of free speech employers who would love to hire you.
All right, guys, you have signed up, right? You've joined freedomsquare.com. If you haven't, why not? This should have happened a decade ago. How did somebody not think of this earlier? If you're a business owner, we have a business directory to promote your business to patriots across the nation. So if you want to buy American, if you want to sell American, we have a business directory. Whatever it is, go now.
Join us in the fight for freedom. Welcome to Freedom Square.
Welcome back to Timeline with Terry. I'm Terry Gilbert. This is the show where we invite expert guests to go deep and broad on these complex issues of the day. This isn't the show for those that like sound bites. It's the show for those who want to listen to what experts have to say. Peter Wood is one of them. He is an author. He is the author of Wrath, America Enraged. I think it's a great book because you've really taken all of this and compiled it into one very interesting and easy read. Before the break, I wanted you to address how Republicans, or people on the right, let me just be general, people on the right always seem to me to be two steps backwards. They don't lead, they're reactive, they're not proactive. Those on the left are always leading the charge. You know, there's always something wrong. They're stirring the soup all the time. Should those on the right take a message from the left and lead the charge on something they're mad about for change?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to that, and I know activists on the right who are attempting to do something like that. But I think there's also the problem that it cuts against temperament, and temperament is deeper than politics. There is those of us who consider ourselves conservative are cautious. We don't want to be thrown overboard by wild emotions that might get us into worse trouble than we're in now. So it's a matter of, can we harness this energy? Can we find the capacity to take those aggressive forward steps without sort of giving in to our worst impulses? And I think reflecting on what happened on January 6th helps with that. That is, there were hundreds of thousands of people in DC that day. Some of them were hanging back. Some of them indeed marched to the Capitol and were observing what was going on. Very few of them, and they were probably incited by FBI agents and the like, actually broke the law and went in and did bad things. Very, very few. Well, there was a moment when people were truly excited, where there was a willingness to take it to the man. Let's go up there and tell these people what's what. Mm-hmm. But they didn't want to break the law. They wanted to engage in a kind of large act of civil disobedience, and they had to be badgered or cajoled into doing bad things, and that not by their own leaders. So there we are. I mean, I do think we need to have a proactive movement to push back against this usurpation of our republic by people who simply want power. And the
While you turn that off, I'm reminded that about the Defeat the Mandate rally. Peter, I went to that, and speaker after speaker reminded everyone this is a peaceful rally. We all love each other. We're here in good faith. We're here to make our voices heard, but we are not interested in any kind of violence, almost like a qualification to be there because of what happened on January 6th. And I saw that as a proactive effort on the part of conservatives. It's taken a while because of the mandates. The mandates kind of had to get to folks before they rallied. But even when they were there, they were utterly polite and standing in temperatures that were in the teens. The speakers were extremely engaging, but with warnings. Behave was kind of the underlying feeling. Otherwise, we're going to get a bad rap.
Well, that goes back to the efforts of the Tea Party, where they would usually show up and be among the most orderly people that had ever showed up at a particular place. They cleaned the grounds when they left. But that all by itself posed such a threat that we had Lois Lerner at the IRS unleashing a campaign of political oppression against them, tried to destroy that movement before it gained even more energy.
That's true.
I think anybody who is an organizer on the right understands that the left does not play fair. It's going to weaponize our laws against us, and we have to be really vigilant and not giving them any excuse to put the handcuffs on. We have our current Attorney General ready to treat the protesters at school board meetings as domestic terrorists. And that really just tells us everything we need to know.
That was outrageous. And I think he kind of got the message. He better pull back on that. Peter, let me take our conversation a little bit in a different direction. I want to talk about the rise of internet usage and get your ideas and reaction. The opportunity for so many people to sound off via the internet, via social media, or even writing nasty emails. I've noticed since, the dawn of people having their own email account, for example, and then, of course, social media, the rise of social media, that there's a kind of keyboard warrior, I would call it, that person out there that bangs away maybe at 2 o'clock in the morning. But boy, they go out in the street and they're polite, they're quiet as a mouse, they're respectful, they go to the grocery store, they stand in line, they let Granny come in front of them. But it's through this, shall I say, third party, which is the internet. I am mad at you, so I'm going to take it out as a warrior on the keyboard. I've noticed a lot of that. And I'd like your reaction to that, because that is really different, right? We're not picking up a sword and attacking each other, a knife or a gun, but boy, sometimes it feels like it on the internet.
Well, I had mentioned earlier that Bush-Gore election. That was really when the internet was coming into its own.
That's
and
right.
At the point when we had websites like the Daily Kos, which were just spewing vitriol, and it became this competitive game when you got onto a website like that, and most of them were on the left. It was a matter of doing this showing off that you could be nastier than the last person. You could come up with a more clever insult with a more cutting denunciation. And so yes, for sure, the rise of social media, this new technology, was an accelerant. It was poured onto an already unstable emotional configuration. People were finding their way into this new lifestyle of perpetual anger, and now they had a way to handle it. I've constantly made the distinction between acting angry and being angry, and pointing out how those things can begin to merge into each other. But certainly the internet provided the stage on which most people learned how to be angry in a political way. And I'm sure, like you, I've had friends who lived on Facebook and found ways to cancel their enemies. People who've been lifelong friends were parting ways over just expressive anger on a page, a bunch of words that really didn't mean anything.
That I would agree with that. I know people who got, well, I know two couples who got a divorce over Obama, and I know one couple who got a divorce over Trump. It was the nastiest thing I have ever seen. I mean, what was that one movie? It escapes me, with Glenn Close. It was like that. I mean, all you have to do is say her name and we remember how angry she was about that. Peter, we're talking about the left and the right. Now, there are those folks out there that will say, look, Tara, it's not the left or the right. It's not Republicans versus Democrats. It's not good versus evil. It's the elite and the elite wannabes versus everybody else. Right. That's where it is. It's this paradigm, this hierarchy. They're above everybody. And what makes it worse is that the elites are narcissistic. So when they get it wrong, they double down. If they get it wrong about kids and masks, it's like, well, now masks have to be on 2-year-olds. They double down. They get it wrong maybe about leaky vaccines, that the vaccine that you got was for the first wave, not for the Omicron or even the Delta wave. Oh, no, now we got to get the boosters. This is very hard to fight against, because most of the time the elites have 2-3 degrees, advanced degrees from top universities. They are in positions of power in government, in finance, in Hollywood. They're influencers, and they have money. And they have lots of money. So how does someone, if you're going to take them on, how do you take on that man? You know, we talk about take on the man, but who's the man in that regard? Is it the left elites, like a person like Nancy Pelosi, who's often ridiculed, and keyboard warriors talk about her? Or is it sort of this, sort of in general, power players globally, the jet setters? And how do you fight them?
Well, I'm very familiar with this argument, and I'm not really quite willing to concede the ground that the left and the elites are that different. I think, yes, there are people who are in the Republican Party who I regard as pretty much in that elite category as well, and the Republican Party and conservatives are certainly not the same thing. So I will start by saying that we are faced with a battle here between people who do control the cultural resources of our civilization. They're the people who are on the boards of universities and museums. They run things even when they're not in high elected office. And that compounding of graduate degrees from elite universities as part of their cultural capital, we're fighting that. Well, Another way to talk about that same thing is to replace the word elites with experts. I think we're dealing with people whose claim on power is frequently a claim of expertise. I know better than you. I've studied this. And even if I don't know better than you, my friend knows better than you because Dr.
And he's on my side.
He's on my side. So rule of experts for us, I think, has begun to fall apart, largely because of how we've seen the COVID epidemic be played against us as a way of seizing power. These experts tend to be people who are more interested in aggrandizing their own positions and accruing power to the authorities in government positions. And we know that now. It's perfectly clear that this epidemic, while there was a real disease, was mishandled in a spectacular level in order to give power to people who didn't deserve it and had no real rational scientific justification for it. And they said, well, we're speaking in the name of science. No, they weren't. They were speaking in the name of their self-interest. Now, that's one place that's happened, but it's also happened when we try to talk in rational terms, dispassionately, about what happened in the 2020 election. You don't have to go crazy about this. You're not necessarily a conspiracy theorist to say which ballots were counted and were they legitimate and how do we know and can we check on these things? And to be told that to even ask those questions is to be courting cancellation on a Facebook post. I've been canceled a bunch of times already, so I have to
badge of honor, right? Is it a badge of honor?
Or you see people going after folks that I regard as some real experts, some of the medical authorities who were raising questions about the direction the country was taking with the epidemic from very early on. So when Joe Rogan gives them a place to talk about it at length on his platform, what do? They try to shut him down. And we are left with this idea that if there is going to be a path of articulate response to this seizure of power by phony experts and by an elite that rules in the name of experts, it's going to be things like your timeline, where we are able to talk about this and talk about it at some length without spinning off into outer space with crazy theories.
Let's hope. Let's hope. A while back, there was a book out by Laura Ingraham called Shut Up and Dribble. Do you remember that? The title was a command by her for LeBron James to stop with the political commentary and just play basketball. And then of late, we have Nancy Pelosi saying to our Olympic athletes, essentially, it wasn't this exact phrase, but the gist of it was, shut up and ski. Why? Because you better behave when you're in communist China. You just better. And don't ruffle any feathers. The Chinese authorities are watching you. Another example was this. Michael Phelps, when asked about the trans swimmer at University of Pennsylvania, I thought he handled it so well because he responded that a competition should be on a level playing field. And other than that, Peter, he said nothing, which signals to me Michael Phelps was staying in his lane, pun intended, right, as staying there, and shutting up about politics and just staying in his own lane. I'm asking this because I'd like your thoughts on this in an effort to keep the vitriol down and still communicate and still be human to each other. Should we stay in our own lane and stop with the political rhetoric? Hold that thought. I'm getting the flag that we got to take another break. And I'd like you to comment about that, because if we did that, maybe we'd have less anger. This is Timeline with Terry. I'm Terry Gilberg. Special guest is Peter Wood. Wrath is the name of his latest book, which we are talking about, America Enraged. Stick around.
CTA is a call to action to all conservatives to save America from left-wing radicals.
Nearly 45% of the US workforce already have plans for job hopping in 2021. Now, many of those 70 million job hoppers are just fed up and they're ready to work somewhere else, somewhere where they will be free. Maybe it's time for your talents to go to a city or a company that actually values your freedom. Post your resume on redballoon.work so that you can connect with this ever-growing list of free speech employers who would love to hire you.
All right, guys, you have signed up, right? You've joined freedomsquare.com. If you haven't, why not? This should have happened a decade ago. How did somebody not think of this earlier? If you're a business owner, we have a business directory to promote your business to patriots across the nation. So if you want to buy American, if you want to sell American, we have a business directory. Whatever it is, go now.
Join us in the fight for freedom. Welcome to Freedom Square.
And we're back on Timeline with Terry. Peter Wood is my guest. We're talking about why America is so mad. America's mad at each other. America's mad at everything. Everything has to be a problem. And it seems like everything is political. What did you think about these three examples, Peter, that I gave you before the break? The shut up and dribble, a command to LeBron James, and then kind of late, Nancy Pelosi telling our Olympians, and she was kind of directing it to some of the first races, which were downhill skiing, to shut up and ski. And then Michael Phelps, another athlete, I thought he handled it well. He didn't talk politics about the trans swimmer, whether or not that even should be happening. He deflected and said it should be a level playing field because, after all, it's a competition. If people stayed in their own lane, would we be less mad at each other?
I've never been asked a question, and my first impression is probably not much. We would still find ways to be really angry at each other. But I'll go further than that. I think that there are experts, and Michael Phelps is a good example. He knows one thing really well, where he can draw on essentially a metaphor that works, that we do want a level playing field. It's sports. But there are a lot of us whose expertise is more diffuse than that. You, for example, and me too. I'm trained as an anthropologist. I spent my life studying basically third world cultures, but I'm now head of an organization of academics. And while my primary topic is what goes on in higher education touches everything. So I'm writing a book like Wrath, which is not about higher education. It's about emotional temperament, about how to understand American culture and its long-term change from one of self-control to one of virulent self-expression. I'm not staying in my lane, and I'm not sure I want other people to as well. Now, when it comes to people who are truly trying to make a point on the basis of expertise, in those situations, yes, you have to very much stay within your lane. Nancy Pelosi is not doing that when she's simply trying to impose political control over athletes who might not be all that comfortable in a society that is committing genocide as they show their athletic skills. But I think that we have to exercise judgment about this. There are times when I'm the expert and I will stay exactly in the zone I know about. There's other times when I think that I can draw on a lifetime of experience to say, this fits with American character. This is good for us. This is where our republic needs to go in order to survive. And at the very beginning of our conversation, we were talking about whether this anger is going to be consistent with a republic that does survive. I can jump.
I'm afraid if it keeps on at this level, and certainly if President Trump jumps back in, I know the town of Washington, D.C. will explode, and maybe the nation will implode. Who knows? I understand. I get your message on that. moving in another direction in the time that we have left. There's more fuel for the fire, Peter, when people criticize talk radio a lot for adding to the rage. And they point to personalities like Michael Savage, for example, or the late Rush Limbaugh, although Rush was calmer. To which I say two things, and I'd like your thoughts. The legacy or mainstream media also has personalities, mostly on television, because they don't live in talk radio. The left didn't make it in talk radio, so they're on television, who really should be anchors and reporters only. Poker-faced anchors, reporters that just give the facts. But they have become, the anchors and reporters, commentators, leading the fight for the left, and they have bigger microphones. They're on their soapbox every day. One comes to mind, Rachel Maddow, for example. And it is this pound constantly of the left's cacophony of voices that come to mind. And it's not just facts, it's just commentary all the time. And yet they sit in a chair, so many of them, at 7 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock at night. And the average American tends to think, well, he's an anchor, even though the commentary is fluid. People point to talk radio, and you even mentioned it earlier, but I would add that the real influencers are those in the talking heads where they should be quiet and just give out facts and anchor a show. And they're on television, and there's many more of them on the left than there are on the right. Thoughts?
Well, I think that the distinction between news and commentary has broken down, and that's largely the result of what's happened with cable news especially. But it's all over our news. It's been breaking down over the last 20-some years. In the world of academia, we call that postmodernism. Nobody believes in facts anymore. Everything is opinion. And if you no longer have a fact-opinion distinction to make, then it all flows into it, one and the other. Now, the professors in the humanities have been preaching this for quite a while, and it's their students eventually who make it up the corporate ladder to these desks at CNN and MSNBC and so on. So there is an education that goes into making people that sloppy with the truth. They've already abandoned the notion of truth. There is simply the social justice perspective that they want to drive.
And with that, they themselves become personalities. The story is no longer the star of the communication. It is the personality, and the story takes a second, is secondary to it. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree with that. As to circle back on Rush Limbaugh, he had a comic persona. He did. Not expressing anger all the time. Occasionally he would get a bit angry, but it was mostly laughing at the left that was his specialization, and they hated that. I think talk radio, because I've done a lot of talk radio as a guest, and I'm familiar with commentators, and it is a world where I can speak more freely than I can anywhere else. I live and work in New York City, and believe me, I am dead silent most of the time in public. I'm not at all silent when there is a camera or a microphone in front of me, and I live in perfect security with that, because I know that my friends and neighbors will never, ever hear me on these other channels. We are that
and yet it's public. And if they want to get to know really who you are, Peter Wood, and the real Peter Wood, they should tune in.
I have friends that
but they won't.
For many, many years. They know vaguely that I write books and that I publish lots and lots of articles and that I do lots of media. But they've never taken the trouble to Google me. Why would they bother? They know who I am. And so I live in this sort of Jekyll and Hyde world where I'm just a nice guy living nearby. And then I'm out as a conservative activist in other circumstances. Now, that division, I think, applies partly to what's going on now, that people's lives are in a certain way fragmented, Mine is. I'm quite cognizant of it. I don't really let it bother me, although I would rather be in a place where I could disagree with people and tell them what I think without fear that this is just going to end the relationship. And that is what we don't have. That's what the anger does to me. It's not that I am bursting with a readiness to tell people off. It's that I want to be able to engage in free conversation with people, which means I'm an excellent listener. I hear what your dental hygienist had to say that time.
That's a true story, too. In the time that we have left, I'd like you to address perhaps some solutions so we can crank it down a little bit, hopefully communicate more. There's an old saying that the last person who speaks wins. So let me put you in the Thanksgiving table situation. And the elephant in the living room, especially if you have Thanksgiving, especially when Thanksgiving, rather, falls after an election. All right? So here's everybody around. It's Grandma, it's Uncle Charlie, it's the kids, it's the all play. And the elephant in the room is the politics. So do you keep talking and try to engage, or do you just shut up and eat? Because if we don't engage, we don't communicate. We don't have relationships. We close off, just like the lockdowns, just like being behind a computer and being a keyboard warrior. That's how we're going to communicate. But we don't have the interface. I think we need to keep communication lines open. But it's a difficult thing when somebody is going to take Thanksgiving and start right away on politics and often ruins it for everybody.
Things can break down very easily. There's an organization based here in New York called Braver Angels that tries to stage these conversations across the DMZ. And, sometimes they have some success with that. I'm skeptical that we get out of this by finding some middle ground where everyone is going to be happy. If I have to be grandpa at Thanksgiving, I guess I would say something like this, assuming that I just didn't decide to take an after dinner snooze. I would say that aren't we blessed to have this republic where we can disagree with each other so very much and hold opinions that are really vital to us and know that the person sitting across from me thinks exactly the opposite, and yet we can like each other. Now, I'm a conservative, and there's liberals that I just think are wonderful people. They're mistaken in some fundamental ways, but they're really good people, and I hope they think I am too, because I try my best. And you and I know we really disagree about this guy who just won the White House, whoever that might be, but we're still in this world together, and we have to do the best we can to make this country work. And we're going to disagree about a lot of things along the way, but one thing that happens is that time passes, and you may have hated Trump, and I might have had not the best view of Biden, but we got through what we got through, and we will in the future. So that's the path towards. And
we're still standing. Peter, that was very diplomatic. It's almost like an after-dinner blessing, the way you delivered that. That was lovely. Final thought here. Peaceful disobedience with all the marches and people go out with the signs. I'm almost convinced they don't work much anymore, unless it's like the truckers and it's something new and different and there's 60,000 trucks, right? What's your take on peaceful disobedience, these long marches where more the merrier, but they're in D.C. almost every day, right? What do you think about that?
Well, not much for marching, but there's other forms of civil disobedience that I think are pretty cool. That is, let those school board members who are trying to propagandize your kids know that you know what they're doing, and that you're intending to vote them out of office at the first opportunity. Now, there's an element there of just plain free speech, but to get your free speech in action these days, you have to be prepared to risk the cops coming in and putting you in handcuffs. So civil disobedience is part of it. There are times and places where you just say no. When members of our military are refusing to be inoculated with vaccines that we now know produce various ailments, swollen hearts and nervous ailments, and they say no, they're putting themselves on the line and they're losing their military commissions. God bless them. That's an act that takes some courage, knowing that our military is now run by people who take their orders from the CDC and Dr. Fauci. I think, okay. So marching, not so much, although sometimes a display of a whole lot of people means something. It scared the devil out of the Biden administration, which wrapped up the Capitol in barbed wire for a couple months after the inauguration. That's not a bad thing for the American public to see just how timid and scared the new regime is. And if they were that confident that they'd won this overwhelming and unlikely majority in the election, did they really have had to wrap up the Capitol in razor wire and fences for all that time? I don't think so.
No, but they had to throw Molotov cocktails into Nordstrom's and Neiman's every single night and set bonfires. That's all the time we have, Peter. What a delightful person you are to speak with. You're so smart. I love this book. Let me pitch it a little bit more. Wrath, America Enraged by Peter Wood. It's got so much in it. It's an easy read, and yet it's very dense. You've really put a lot to this, and I commend you for it. Thanks for being on the program. One final thought, if you can just wrap up your thought in one sentence, and I'll give you the last word.
Last word is, let anger be your servant, not your master. Go out there and use what powers you've got to try to bring our society back to a civil, livable, and decent order.
Maybe with good temperament and the art of the debate. I say let's get back to that. Peter Wood, thanks for coming on the program. This has been Timeline with Terry. I'm Terry Gilberg. Till next time, tune into Timeline.